All right, let's get going. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cristina Stanchu, and I'm an associate professor of English and the director of the Humanities Research Center at VCU. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event of the semester in the HRC series, Meet VCU Authors. In partnership with VCU Libraries, Meet VCU Authors invites members of the Richmond community, as well as colleagues and students from VCU and other local universities, to meet VCU authors as they talk about their recently published books and answer questions about their work. Although we still can't meet in person this semester due to public health concerns, we look forward to recognizing our VCU authors in the College of Humanities and Sciences and beyond in this format before we can resume our talks in person before long, we hope. I'd like to thank Rani Sisavath, our new administrative and communications assistant, as well as Alexis Fink, who doesn't need an introduction, but she's our director of communications in the college, for all their help behind the scenes. It takes a lot of effort to put these events together, so I'd like to give them a shout out. This communications team is essential to ensuring that our robust programming continues as the HRC is preparing to become a university-wide research center at VCU. As most of you know, our events follow a more or less similar format. I will briefly introduce our guest, who then will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And in the meantime, you can use the Q&A function to post your questions or comments. So on to the fun part. I am beyond thrilled to welcome to the HRC one of my academic role models, Dr. Danielle Dick, who is currently the Greg Brown Endowed Chair in Neuroscience and the Inaugural Director of the Rutgers Addiction Research Center at Rutgers University, and until very recently, the Commonwealth Professor of Psychology and Human and Molecular Genetics at VCU, where she was the founding director, as many of us know, of the Center for Research on Behavioral and Emotional Health. Danielle has led and contributed to more than 20 grants from the NIH, NSF, and private foundations, with grant funding totaling over $30 million. And Danielle, for those of us in the humanities, this is a bit unimaginable. So congratulations on that. Danielle has over 350 peer-reviewed publications in the areas of child development, addiction, mental health, genetics, and human behavior, and has won numerous national and international awards for her work. Professor Danielle Dick has been named one of the top 1.5% most highly cited researchers in the world across all fields of science. Her talk today will be about the child code, her new book, published just a few months ago by Penguin and Random House. About this book, Dr. Michelle Borba, who is an educational psychologist, says, and I quote, "Genetics do play a crucial role in shaping children's destinies, but parents are missing the toolkit that shows how to follow their children's code and maximize their potential. Fortunately, Dr. Dick provides that sorely missing piece. All we need to do is tune in to our kids' unique codes and use these strategies," end quote. And as Dr. Judson Brewer adds, in this book, Dr. Danielle Dick brings her deep experience as both a parent and a scientist to reveal the powerful influence of genetics on a child's behavior and how this knowledge can help shape successful parenting. Some of the highlights of the Amazon reviews, all of them overwhelmingly positive, include comments such as, "Must read for anyone with young children. Wish I had this book when my kids were babies," or "Must read for every parent." And my favorite so far, quote, "Maybe it's not actually all my fault," end quote. Many congratulations and welcome back to VCU, Danielle. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. It is my pleasure to get to be here speaking with until very recently, VCU colleagues. I'm still affiliated with VCU, and I'm still living here in Richmond quite a bit of the time. So hopefully we'll still get to cross paths quite a bit. I am obviously very grateful for the nearly 15 or plus years I've spent at VCU. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey to writing this book. And so let me get my slides shared here. Okay, Christina, does that look good in the proper view for you all?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fabulous. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, why would an academic researcher decide to write a popular press book, which I didn't even know until I started down this journey was even called a trade book. But I'm going to talk a little bit about why I decided to go down this path and why I think it's something useful for other researchers as well. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to write a trade book. So the kind of nuts and bolts that went into this process of going from, okay, I want to write a book, I'm interested and have some ideas that I want to share, but I had literally no idea how to go about that. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about that process in ways that I hope will be helpful to some of you. I'm happy to field any additional questions on that as well too. And then I'm going to get to this part about why parents, really all of us, should care about genetics, a little bit about the nuts and bolts of what's actually in the book. And then of course, I'll open it up to your questions and we can dive into any of that further. So I'm going to start with the why I decided to start down this path. As Christine was talking about, I really spent the first decade plus of my career doing all the traditional things that academics do. And so I am trained across both psychology and genetics, and I wrote a lot of grants, I taught classes, I trained students, I wrote scientific papers, I published I spoke at scientific conferences, I got tenure. I was sort of doing all the traditional academic things, but there was a point probably after I'd become a tenured full professor that I had this moment where I thought, okay, in academia, we're fortunate to have long careers. I have several decades ahead of me, I hope. What is really my goal over the next phase of my career? Is it really just to write hundreds and hundreds of more papers and have my CV grow longer and longer? And that really wasn't why I went into this business. I think many of us go into academia or research because we care so deeply about our topic. We're passionate about what we're studying. And we think that by studying and doing research in this area, we can make the world a better place. We can contribute to knowledge. And the thing that was bothering me is that really in all of my grants and in all of my papers, there was a sentence that said something like, understanding how genetic and environmental influences come together to impact human behavior can help us design more effective prevention, intervention, and treatment. And I had this moment where I realized who was actually doing that translational step, because we are so specialized in academia very frequently that the individuals who are doing prevention and treatment, they're not reading basic genetics journals. They have their own journals and their own conferences and their own sort of academic circles. And so I sort of had this awakening where I was like, I think it's me who has to do more to try and get this research out to people who can use it. The other thing that was going on in my life is that I had become a parent at that point. So I had a son and I found myself raising the challenging child that I study. So highly impulsive, highly emotional. He could be coloring a picture and we could be happily sitting there at the table together. And next thing you know, he'd like crumpled it up and thrown it on the floor and stormed off to his room and slammed the door. And I was like, oh, the blue in the sky must not have been the perfect color. So it was a really challenging period for me as a parent. And the research was so helpful in really candidly saving my sanity, because I understood about what was contributing to this behavior and what I could do about it. But I found so many of my parent friends who were having these same kind of struggles that I was, but they were really kind of riddled with self-doubt and with, concern that they were doing something wrong, that their child wouldn't sit still in the pew at church or was throwing big fits at Target. And so I found myself talking to my friends about the research a lot as well. And that was kind of the kernel of the idea of, someday I need to write a book about this. And several years later, and my son is in a much easier developmental phase now, and I really kind of got serious about, okay, I think that this is the time that I want to try to write a book. And I knew I wanted to write a book for parents because I felt like the research was so valuable for parents. As my son was in school, I found myself increasingly connected to schools and talking at parent events and at different school events. And so I knew that was the audience I wanted to write for. But I had absolutely no idea how one goes about writing a book. This was not something I had learned at all in graduate school. I knew a lot about how to do research and how to get research out to other researchers, but I didn't at all understand this process of writing a popular press book. So a book that is not an academic press, which is a similar but somewhat different process. And I was fortunate in that one of our colleagues, Ev Worthington in the Department of Psychology, who some of you may know, he actually did a seminar similar to this, where he was talking a little bit about the process of writing a trade book. And so I essentially took him out to coffee and picked his brain all about, how do you actually go about doing this? Because I had no idea where to start. And I would say I learned two huge things that really got me started down that path, which the first was, he said to me, you know how to write NIH grants, and you know that there is essentially a format you follow. Well, putting together a proposal for a trade book has its own format. I'll tell you all, it's not nearly as complicated as an NIH grant, but it was helpful to know, oh, okay, this is the format. And he was kind enough to share one of his previous book proposals with me. And basically, and some of you all may know this, it can be quite long. I think my proposal was about 50 pages or so. And there's essentially a short, 3 or so pages, an overview of what the book is going to be about. And then there is an outline of all of the chapters and a short summary of what's going to be in every single chapter. And then there is a whole section about you, why you are uniquely qualified to write this book, why people are going to buy a book from you on this topic. And then there's a section kind of about other books in this area, or the market. Who is this book for? And what are the other books already in this space? Is there another book out there on this topic? And if so, how does your book differ from the other books that are out there and that are similar? And then you have a draft chapter. My book kind of unfolded in two parts. And so I had a draft chapter from each part of the book. The second piece that Ev told me that really stuck with me was, to write a trade book, you have to have an agent. That really is the big difference, is that you can't simply put together a proposal and send it off to editors or to publishing houses. Publishing houses only work with agents as the kind of intermediary. And you can see why that might be, because all of us academics and writers can have our own, neuroses and be challenging to deal with. And so they are essentially dealing with agents who know the business. I'll tell you, agents are kind of a flat, they take a 15% commission. So there's really no variability in that. But all I knew was, okay, I have to put together this proposal and I have to find an agent. And I'll tell you the way that, and I knew nothing else, by the way, about this process at all. And so the way that I went about finding an agent is, and I'll tell you, I played around with kind of writing just to find my voice. I was so used to scientific writing that I found writing for parents actually to be a lot more fun. It's a far more informal way of writing. And so I really, I spent some time, this was kind of a project on the side for me. And so I spent time playing around and thinking about what are all the things that I would want to put in the book for some time before I got serious and said, okay, let's craft it into the proposal format. And in the meantime, I had read a lot of books written by other psychologists that did well. So books like Mindset by Carol Dweck and other kind of popular press books, but that were written by researchers. And I will tell you that in the acknowledgement section, they always thank their agents. And so what I essentially did was I went through those acknowledgement sections of the handful of books, wrote down who their agents were, looked up the agents online, sort of read a little bit about them. Different agents and different literary agencies can specialize in different types of books. So for example, some are more looking at science fiction writers, others are looking at nonfiction writers, some of them work with a lot of academics. Obviously, the agents that I'd kind of found through these similar books were individuals who worked in the kind of working with a lot of academic nonfiction popular press writers. And I literally just kind of sent off a little email with a few sentences about who I was, attached my proposal to probably 5 or 6 agents. And I heard back from probably about 4 out of the 6 people that I emailed. And just to give you an idea of how little I knew and how this is possible for anyone to do, because I had no inside knowledge here, the night before, essentially the agents responded and they would set up a phone call to talk further. And the night before my first call with the first agent, I literally Googled what to talk to an agent about, because I knew you needed one, but I knew nothing else beyond that. What I actually found is that speaking with multiple agents was very helpful. It reminded me a lot of dating in the sense that they're trying to figure out if they want to work with you, and you're trying to figure out if they are a good fit for you to work with them. And even with those 4 so different people that I talked to, the conversations were extremely different, ranging from one agent who said, this is one of the best proposals that I've seen. I think I could sell it as is, to another agent who was like, I really don't think this is very good at all. I'd want to change it in like 50,000 different ways. And, one who was kind of in between and said, I'd sort of like to see the book take this direction and then reconsider your proposal. And the agent I ended up working with was someone who we clicked. We had a good chemistry. I felt like she got my book and what I was trying to do, but she also had really good ideas that ultimately made the book much better. So I liked her ideas, and we actually spent probably about 6 months rewriting my proposal. Everything from, we changed the title because she was like, okay, here is how books that sell well, here is how their titles are crafted. And here is the market on parenting books. And essentially I put in everything that I thought parents should know, basically from like birth through young adults. And she was like, parents don't buy books like that. They buy them in developmental segments. So we can think of it as a series of books, and we need to start kind of, we looked at what the biggest markets were, also what made sense to start kind of at the beginning with young kids. And so she really helped me recraft that proposal into a much, much stronger one. And the other piece I hadn't realized is agents really are extremely important, because that person is totally driving the process, in that once you get your proposal to a place where you're both happy, they send it off to the editors and publishing houses and the imprints, which are the little divisions under publishing houses. Imagine it's sort of like departments under the university. they are choosing what editors to send it to and what imprints could be good for you. And what I realized in retrospect is that she was incredibly good at doing her homework. She's a researcher too of her own sort, and figuring out what imprints tended to publish books with other authors like me. She also looked for editors who were parents and who had small children. And so we really resonated that way. And essentially she sent it off to probably about, I think like 10 different imprints, all from the big 5 publishing houses. And within a week or so, she was like, I need you in New York because I want you to come meet with, we have interest. And so I flew up to New York and met with several of the editors. And then the book goes to auction if there's multiple houses that are interested. And the editor, your agent sets up that entire process. They set it up in terms of is it a one size fits all, meaning put in your best offer and then we'll choose one. The way we set it up was actually with 2 rounds where it's sort of like, put in your best offer, and then we narrowed it down, and then we kind of went back to them and said, okay, what's really your best offer? And so all of those things, again, I knew nothing. My agent totally held my hand through this process, but that's why you also want to find an agent who has some experience and who is a good fit for you, because you end up trusting a lot, putting a lot into their hands. So after you sell the book, then you have essentially 12 months to turn in the final manuscript. Because this was my first book, my editor essentially asked to see it. I think we signed in November, December, and she was like, send me something in early spring with the first few chapters, just to make sure we're on the same page. And I did, and it was, she was like, great, press on. And my back and forth with my editor was not a ton. So when I turned in the manuscript, she turned around and essentially sent me comments. And unlike, I'll tell you, many of the peer review comments you might get when you're submitting your articles to different journals, where you think like, oh, I'll do this, but it's actually not making the paper better, I don't think, because they want you to address this or that. There's something to be said for working with professional editors, because her comments also made the book so much better. So she would say things like, you ended this chapter here, and based on that, I thought you were going to pick up at this next step, but you jump ahead to another place. And I would read it and go, oh, she's absolutely right. So we essentially, I did that one round of her edits, and then you just sit and you wait after the final manuscript is accepted for about 9 months for the book to actually come out in print. And in that time, and here's the piece that I didn't fully appreciate, but what they then really want you to be working on is setting up, how are you going to sell the book? And so one of the, you are matched up with someone from the publishing house who does both. You have a marketing person and a PR person. And they were like, okay, so what website are you going to use? And they were like, do you want to use your VCU website? Well, as many of us know, our university websites are not always the dynamic kind of websites that we might want to be, like the outward facing presence for something like a popular press book, for example. And they were like, and so what's your social media and PR surrounding the book? And I was like, oh, social media. And so I actually took part of my advance and invested in working with a company to do the website and set up social media pieces. And I will tell you, I feel like this is a screenshot. They both put together a website for the book where you can, directly, so it's thechildcode.com, where you can read about the book, you can directly order the book. In addition, they put together a personal website. So if you look up danielledick.com, there would be information kind of about who I was as well, in a way that was much more of a kind of user-friendly, why genetics is important to your day-to-day life than you might get on, for example, the university websites. So it was something that I didn't have to do, but it was also recommended. And a lot of the authors that you see out there doing press and whose books are doing extremely well, I will tell you, I've met many authors who are investing $10,000 a month and more in PR and marketing teams and all of that piece. I certainly didn't go that route, but I mentioned that just because I have a better understanding now when you think like, wow, how come these people are always in front of the camera and being picked up and doing these things? That doesn't just happen by accident. So there are people at the big publishing houses to help you with it, but ultimately you can let it take over as much of your life as you want. And that is a piece that I'll be perfectly candid and say, I still have not quite found the right balance. My book came out in September. It was a hard time to have a parenting book come out because, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And as any of you all who are parents know, there is a lot going on with our kids right now in terms of masks and schools and changing rules and vaccines. And so much of the press has all been COVID related that there has not been as much press. So it's been kind of, doing podcasts and one-off things with the different news media. And of course, many of us are trying to balance this with what I call my real job, right? Being a university professor. I also started a new job. And so I'm trying to continue research projects and all of that at the same time. So I'll just be candid that is something that is a little challenging. And when I've spoken to a couple other close friends who've had books come out at the same time, that's all something that we've talked about needing to figure out how to balance. So just a heads up that that's a piece I didn't at all think about or anticipate. So I'm going to switch to kind of the last piece that I'm going to talk about, which is a little bit about the background behind the book and the science behind the book. Why, if you are a parent, if you know or have friends who are parents, if you have parents, why essentially all of us should care about genetics. And one of the things that I find so amusing about being a parent is that human beings have been raising tiny human beings for literally hundreds of thousands of years. We have done amazing things over the course of history. Why is it that parenting still feels so hard? And the thing I find interesting is that it's not for any lack of advice. There's no shortage of parenting books and magazines and blogs. We can hear in the news about tiger moms and helicopter parents and snowplow parents. We are a culture that's literally obsessed with parenting. We spend more time today trying to actively shape and parent our children than parents ever have in the course of human history. Which really begs the question, with so much information out there, why is parenting still so darn hard? In other words, what is going on? And I think that one of the things that's contributing to why parenting feels so challenging is that most of that mainstream parenting information that's out there is ignoring a fundamental biological fact, which is the profound influence of our kids' genes on their behavior. In fact, the single biggest factor that affects kids' behavior in study after study after study after study, this is unambiguous, is kids themselves. It's actually not our parenting. And by that, what I mean is that kids are all born with unique genetic dispositions that code for everything from their impulsivity to their self-regulation to essentially fear, frustration, their propensity toward anxiety, toward addiction, toward sociability, toward extroversion. It turns out that in study after study about half of the differences in kids' behavior is due to differences in the genetic codes that they were born with. So maybe right now you're thinking, well, this is not really helpful because, oh, by the way, it turns out that that other half, it's not like half is due to our parenting and half is due to the genetic material they were born with. Half of the differences in all kids' behavior, why some kids are more impulsive than others or more anxious than others, is due to differences in their DNA. And the other half is due to all of the things in their environment, their peers, their neighborhoods, school effects, and us as parents, but we're just one little part of that big constellation of what is their world. So parents, I think, will sometimes pause at this point and go, well, this is not helpful. I am the person who is in the trenches trying to figure out what to do with my child on a day-to-day basis. I can't change their genes. So what am I supposed to do with this information? And I think that's why it's basically just been ignored in most of the information that gets out there to parents. And I think that that is a huge mistake for two big reasons. The first is what I call the parenting myth. And little random aside, that was actually what I had originally called the book in the proposal that I sent off to agents. And I can talk about why we changed it if you're interested in, but small little fact that I don't actually know that I've ever said before. But the parenting myth is basically the idea that we can super parent our kids into that Nobel Prize and that Ivy League school. So the idea is if we just, really do everything right with our kids, we can mold them into these dreamy human beings that we all imagined having. And the problem with this is that it creates a tremendous amount of pressure on parents. And to this day, largely on moms. It creates the idea that if you want a better child, you need to be a better parent. You need to do more of, fill in your favorite parenting advice here. You need to read more books. You need to take more advice from your mother-in-law. If your child is struggling, you must be doing something wrong. It can also put a lot of pressure on our kids who can feel this tremendous weight of our expectations. Rates of anxiety are higher in children right now, even pre-COVID, than they ever have been before. And the other thing is that in addition to the pressure it can put on parents and on kids, it can also create this culture of judgment. And I'm willing to bet that, if we're honest, we'll admit that we've all done this at some point. I certainly have. I have seen the parent, whose child is throwing a fit at Target, or the teenager who's talking back to their parent, and you look from the kid to the parent, and you think that parent really needs to, whatever is your favorite parenting advice. And really, parents who are dealing with challenging behavior in kids, they've probably read more books and listened to more advice, and they're feeling more judgment than the rest of us combined. And so what they really need is our support, not our judgment. The other piece that I think is a really unfortunate side effect of our doubling down on parenting and ignoring the genetics piece is that by ignoring the genetics, the profound role of our kids' unique codes that they're all born with, we are essentially making it harder on ourselves. Because by better understanding how your child is wired, it allows you to tailor your parenting accordingly to what their biggest needs are. So if we were all together, I would ask how many folks have heard of the Precision Medicine Initiative. Because I know many of us are academics, I'm guessing some of you probably have. I find that when I talk to general audiences, very few people have. For those of us who are in biomedical research, it's what we spend tons of our time talking about. There's literally billions of dollars going into precision medicine. And the whole idea is that right now, most of us go to the doctor when something is wrong. Maybe some of us are good and we do our annual checkups and preventative care, but most doctor's appointments result from something being wrong. And then there is a trial and error process of trying to figure out what the problem is and then what kind of treatment is going to work best for this person. And that whole process is incredibly costly. It's costly to the individuals who are struggling, to their families, to our healthcare system. And the idea behind precision medicine is that our genes harbor a ton of information about what we're at risk for and what we're less at risk for. And we should be able to harness that to move medicine from essentially a treatment-based model to one that is more predictive and personalized and ideally preventative. And there are many parallels to how we handle parenting. Often we go looking for help or advice, or we read books, or we consult with folks when our kids are struggling, when we're having problems. But our kids' genes influence a lot more than just, their eye color and their hair color and their propensity to asthma or allergies. They also influence the way that their brains are shaped and their behavior. And by understanding each of our children's kind of unique wiring, it can allow us to tailor our parenting accordingly. And it can help us figure out what strategies are going to work best and reduce a lot of the stressors that we experience on a day-to-day basis as we're just trying to figure out and wing it with what's working best with our kids. And the way that this all works, of course, is that our genes influence not any one particular thing, right? We're not carrying genes for addiction or genes for depression or genes for impulsivity. Our genes instead influence the way that all of our brains are wired, which we can look around and see all the differences that exist between humans on the outside. We have lots of similarities, but we also have amazing diversity. And that is true of the way that we are wired on the inside as well. And these differences in the ways that our brains are wired influence things like how we respond to reward and to risk, how we can handle anxiety, our disposition towards extroversion or being more introverted, these things that we call personality or temperament. And then these traits influence how we interact with our environments. And so sensation-seeking adolescents are the ones who are more likely to be hanging out at bars, or impulsive little kids are the ones who are more likely to be wanting to climb around on the playground equipment, or who are running around breaking things in your house. Our genes also influence the responses that are evoked from us by the world. And so, for example, babies that are really cranky, they don't get held as much. Other adults don't reach out and give them as much love and want to hold them as much. So our temperamental characteristics, maybe kids who are shy and who are hiding behind their parents' legs all the time, they get less interaction with other adults. So our dispositions also influence the way that the world essentially responds to us, and they influence the way we respond to the world. So my husband and I can walk outside, same weather, same day, and I can go, oh, it's freezing. And he goes, oh, it feels great. Different wiring, and we literally respond to the same environment in a different way. Another example is you could be at a cocktail party with a colleague and you are having a conversation with a coworker over the ham biscuits, and you walk away from that conversation and you turn to your colleague and you're like, oh, that person drives me crazy. And the other person is like, I think they're great. Exact same interaction, but we experience it differently based on our own dispositions. Then, of course, those interactions with the world further feedback and influence brain development. And so this whole process is influenced by our genes, by the unique dispositions that we all start life with, which then impacts the way that we move through the world. And that is why genes can end up playing such a large role in behavior and in interpersonal interactions. Humans, our brains like to make meaning of things. And so oftentimes we make meaning from the things that we can see, from our interactions with our parents, from interactions with the environments. And of course, those are very important. But our genes are often a hidden, unconscious force, which is also shaping our behavior because we are all experiencing the world in different ways because our brains are literally wired differently. So by understanding that, by understanding your child's unique disposition, you can essentially recognize and anticipate challenge points, and you can help focus on with your kids, with each individual child, what are some of their lagging skills. There's no right way to parent. There's no one way to parent. There are only strategies that work better or sometimes worse for different types of kids based on their dispositions. And the other thing is that by helping kids appreciate their strengths, you can help your child feel comfortable in their own skin and feel loved for who they are instead of maybe trying to be molded into who you might have imagined they would have been. And many times we do this unconsciously as parents. And so as one example, I am a highly extroverted person. For anybody out there who knows me, I love people. That is enjoyable to me. It's what my brain likes. And we only know our own way of being in the world. And when my son was little, on Saturday mornings, I used to plan outings for him. And he would wake up and he'd come downstairs and we'd be having a lovely breakfast. And I would say, guess what? Today we are going to go to the playground or the science museum, and we are going to meet up with, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and their kids. And isn't it going to be so much fun? And next thing I know, he would, take off his shoes, throw a shoe across the room, storm up to his room and slam the door. And it was like, what just happened? And what I eventually realized when I paid more attention is my son is far more introverted than I am. And so what sounded like fun to me was very stressful to him. And, his little toddler brain did not have the wherewithal to say, Mom, that sounds very stressful and anxiety provoking to be with a bunch of people that I don't know well in an unfamiliar setting. How about we just do a play date with maybe one friend instead? Instead, what he just did is, he has this physiological reaction and he throws a shoe. So what you can do by understanding your child's temperament is to essentially help craft the environment such that it'll decrease these stress points and you can teach them lagging skills. So essentially what we did is we worked our way back up to play dates with lots of folks by essentially helping him develop some of those social skills and that comfort and familiarity. So that's just kind of one example of how by understanding your child's disposition, you can help reduce some of those tension points and also help kids really thrive. You can essentially move from a reactive mode to a more proactive mode with your kids. And the idea here is really, how do you take, this child, for example, who is highly impulsive, who's falling out of trees, ending up in the ER, giving parents a heart attack when they're small, who we know is also far more likely as they get older to turn into this child. But not necessarily. There's no reason that sensation-seeking, impulsive disposition can't be channeled into this or to this. We actually know that CEOs, entrepreneurs, fighter pilots, much higher on risk-taking and novelty-seeking. And in fact, for full disclosure, some of you all may recognize that this little risk taker is in fact my little risk taker, who comes by it very honestly. His father, my brother are in fact all fighter pilots, which really brings us to this key piece that DNA is not destiny. It's not like we are destined to have a certain outcome, but our dispositions also aren't something to be ignored. We do that at our own peril because we make parenting much harder on ourselves. So the way that my book is actually structured is the first part is a little bit about the science behind the many ways that kids' genes influence their behavior. And some of these loops we've talked about a little bit, and how sometimes if you have a natural fit with your child on certain dimensions, so you have sporty parent who takes the child out to sports games and to fun-filled activities, and you might have an outgoing child who loves that and they thrive in that environment. And in those cases, when there's matches like that, which are often by luck of the draw, parenting can feel very easy. But you can also imagine that maybe you have a parent who really loves reading or going to the museum. And so they take their child along for those activities. And instead, the child is running around pulling books off the shelves or trying to touch everything at the museum. And the whole day gets spent disciplining them. Nobody's having fun. It's leading to tension. It's leading to friction. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to understand our kids so that we can be more proactive about figuring out how to help them thrive. And so I walk through, the first part is kind of a little bit about the science behind all of this. And then the second part of the book is really about 3 big genetically influenced temperamental dimensions that our kids differ on. They've shown up in multiple studies all around the world. I call them the 3 E's in the book. And they are essentially extroversion. We all differ in how much we draw energy from being around other people. How much do our kids want to be the center of attention and like our praise and our feedback and our attention versus how much do they need more quiet time to themselves? And what are the implications of that? Our kids all differ, we all differ on our emotionality, how quick certain kids are to fear, frustration, or distress is something that is also strongly genetically influenced. And that can be one of the hardest temperamental characteristics for parents. And there's certain parenting strategies that work better for kids who are highly emotional. And then our kids all differ on their effortful control, or what's often called self-control or impulse control. And so there's certain strategies that can work better or worse for kids depending on where they naturally fall on how impulsive they are or how much they really have good effortful control. And so I actually have surveys or quizzes. They're based loosely on the kinds of surveys we use in research for parents to fill out. And then there's really strategies for what kinds of activities and for parenting techniques work best for different types of kids. And then there's also sections about navigating co-parenting. So if you are not the only adult involved in raising your child, there's other adults, their brains are wired in their own way. You know, very often we see parenting differently depending on our own unique wiring, and that can cause tension sometimes between partners. I know it certainly has in our house from time to time. I'm guessing I'm not alone on that. There's a chapter about kind of how do you navigate that? How do you navigate the fact that we might see the world and see our kids and our parenting in different ways, as well as how you can work with parents, with teachers and coaches and other caregivers or adults in the child's life. And then there's also a piece really on how to differentiate kind of quote normal behavioral variation from clinical disorders or when you should seek help, because that was something a question that I got a lot from parents is this normal? And so it's kind of addressing that question and how do you understand where your child falls on a dimension and when to reach out and seek help. So I'm going to stop talking here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. And at this point, I would love to open it up to any questions that you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you to all of you who are here and are getting ready to get your questions in the Q&A box. I see a hand up. This is also possible. I can also unmute. Oh, or there was a hand up at some point, but I think we lost that participant. How about I start with a question, and then I will invite the rest of the audience to either raise their hands or to pose the question in the Q&A. So let's go back a little bit, Danielle, to the parenting myth. And I was very intrigued that, of course, changing the title is something that commonly happens with, to book writers. But I'm curious why you decided to change the title and what the sort of initial framing of the book in that way was, right? How that title would have led to a potentially different book.
Yes, the interesting thing is that, so my husband's background is actually in PR and marketing. And he all along said, I don't like the parenting myth. It sounds too negative. And I was like, well, this is important information for parents to have. And he was like, no, you want it to be more proactive. Like, what can they do with this information? And so sure enough, then, and I was like, no, I'm doing it my way. And then when I, of course, had an agent and we were having these conversations, and she was like, are you open to changing the title? And so, yes, I had to go back and, tell my husband, you were right. And I think, honestly, part of it for me was that I started from the place that I think many academics do, which is that I was very comfortable with the generation of knowledge and putting that knowledge out there. But I was less comfortable with telling parents what to do with it, because I felt like, here is the information, and then you can take this in many different ways. It's not my job to tell you what to do with it. And essentially what I was told over and over again, and I have come to understand better, is people actually do want to be told what to do. They don't just want to know the research and know this is what's going on. They want to know, like, okay, what do I do with that? And, we can look around in our world and see there's many people that fill that void, that will tell you what to do, how to raise your kids, how to do all kinds of things. And if it's not and many times academics are not those leading voices. Somebody else is stepping in to fill that void. And if we don't do it, somebody else will. And it is, in all likelihood, will be somebody who knows less about the material than we do. And it was ultimately kind of realizing that of course, I do have some background in clinical psychology and developmental psychology in addition to the genetics. And so I, of course, pulled it all together in ways that helped me in my parenting. But I felt like, well, I don't want to tell other people what they can do. And really, they were like, no, this is your book, and people do want to know what they can do with the information. And so that was really how it got restructured. And then the title changed. It changed actually 3 times. It went from the parenting myth to the baby code, which was the title my agent came up with. And then the editor said, are you wedded to that? Because it's not really about babies, right? People think of babies, they think of like swaddling and bottles and, those kind of things. And so that's when it ended up at the child code, which I really like. So this is one of those times where it was a collaborative process, and I feel like it actually did get better along the way.
Absolutely. That's a great story. And I will take the questions in the order in which we received them. I think the first question is about the difference in how trade press books sell as opposed to academic titles. So it's also an anonymous question. So the person anonymized themselves. And the question is, how many books have you sold so far? I don't know if you want to answer that, but, as somebody who, my second book is coming out with the university press, and my first one is also with the university press. We tend to anticipate maybe 2,500 in the first run, 2,500, copies, maybe 5,000. Once the book is in paperback, then there will be more copies. So academic books tend to sell fewer copies.
So the answer to that is I honestly don't know. I could look it up. They actually, Penguin Random House has a great author website. You can look up, you can track book sales by week. But what I found is that was actually tremendously stressful to me, because I sort of had this view of like, well, you write your book and then it's out there and it's going to be like an instant bestseller. And I will tell you that certainly, didn't happen. And I remember Ev Worthington saying, told me once that it's like some teeny portion of books ever sell more than 10,000 copies or whatnot. And I was worried enough because of these pandemic related reasons. Actually, nonfiction is doing very poorly in the pandemic. Fiction is doing very well. People want to read to escape. They don't have any bandwidth to read to learn more, unfortunately. And I understand that, and parents in particular. And so I started getting a little panicky at the beginning because I was watching like week by week by week. And, I was like, oh my gosh. And so I actually met with my publishing team and I was like, am I going to get dropped if it doesn't sell, like however many thousands of books, or will it not go into paperback, or, am I never going to be able to write another book again? And what essentially my, imprint told me, I'm with Avery, and they've been amazing to work with. And they basically said, we invest in authors and in books that we believe in. And this book is now a part of you, and it will be a part of, of you and your academic presence, and when you talk to parents and when you're out there. And so we don't need them to be instant bestsellers. We believe in you. We believe in this book. And we have books that, they hit their kind of, they sell more than they ever have before, 10 years out from when they were published. And so when they told me that, and then candidly between like starting a new job and the Christmas holidays and all of that, I just was like, for my own mental health, I need to stop checking weekly. So I actually have no idea. Sorry, I can't give you more information than that, but that's where I stand right now.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. And also what a terrific answer from the press, right, in encouraging authors, whose work they believe in. I think this is just a great sign, and it's only been a couple of months, so greatness is coming in the reception. Michael Dickinson, our colleague from the Department of History, whose own book is coming out in just a couple of months with an academic publisher, is asking, could you speak a bit more about how your book talks in particular differed for a trade book than they would for a traditional academic book?
So sorry, the question is like the voice, or I'm a little bit confused about which about differs how.
So Michael Dickinson, I'm going to unmute you if I can find you here so you can clarify your question. Is that okay?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. Can you hear me?
Sure. Go ahead.
So I think my question really has to do with I think the voice, Danielle, about how you're sort of communicating your findings and the sort of the takeaways to your audience in a different way than you would for an academic audience in events. And I know you mentioned podcasts, and so I'm just curious about how your transition that looked in terms of communicating your findings.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Also, it's good to hear from you. I remember when I was sitting on your, the faculty search where we recruited you to VCU. So it's wonderful to hear about your book coming out. And so yes, it's very different. For me, it felt comfortable in the sense that I like talking to general audiences about research. And one of the things that I have always loved is taking a complex concept, something like the way genes work, and being able to explain that, whether that was to graduate students or to other faculty who, don't work in genetics, or to parents. So that's something I've always kind of done throughout my career, because I believe that we need to be able, no matter how complex what you're working on, you need to be able to explain why it's important to, everyone from your grandmother to your students to the person that you're sitting next to on the subway. And that's good for all of us for getting the information out about why what we're working on is important. So I would say that, especially for any junior folks like graduate students, those elevator pitches, when I sit on dissertation committees, my question always is, pretend a reporter is asking you, like, what is the key takeaway from this? Why should I print this. Why should someone care? And I think that the ability to think about why is this important is critical for us to be able to make our work relevant, and in ways that are not super jargony and technical and academic, which all of our fields have. Like I said, when I was actually writing, I spent some time. I love writing. It's why I write so many grants and so many academic or scientific papers. But I also just sort of wrote as if I was talking to someone. And I would say that's sort of the biggest takeaway for me is one of my favorite things is at a book launch party, one of my neighbors came up to me and she had an early copy of the book because she happened to be sitting on her porch when my first box came in and I gave her one. And she said, so at this book launch party, she came up to me and she said, so I've been reading your book and I really like it. And I laughed and I said, you seem so surprised. And she said, well, I thought it was going to be like really sciencey and heavy and because you study genetics. And she's like, but it's like we're having a glass of wine together and I can hear you talking to me. And that is the mindset that I am in when I write. I'm writing for parents, right? But whenever I write for any audience, you're in conversation with someone, even if it's a one-way conversation, right? Or their responses are delayed. I explain it to somebody the way that I would want someone to explain it to me, where it's user-friendly, where it's fun, or it's full of examples. And that's what I try to do when I talk to parents and to general audiences. And I work with the press and whatnot too. The thing that my PR husband tells me, and I'm still not great at, is to really you need to come up with what are your key points and just stick to them and do not elaborate and don't go off script. So, he says no more than 3. And then if you note politicians, the ones that do this well, regardless of what question gets asked, they circle back to what are the key messages that they want people to take. So there's certain things like that, like media training and other things that can help. But really, I think the big thing is to think of it like a conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for the question. I don't see other questions in the chat. I have one more question for you, Danielle, if I may, and then we can wrap it up because dinner is coming. I have a question that you are probably answering. I'm midway through the book, so you are probably answering it in later chapters. But for parents in the audience and for other curious minds, could you talk a little bit about genetic mapping and access to parents, because this is something I believe in, but in terms of actually getting to read and translate that information, I wonder how this works.
So when you're talking about genetic mapping, are you talking about specific genotypes and actually getting genotypic information? Yes.
About your child, exactly.
Yes. So I actually don't talk a ton about that in the book. And so I'm glad that you asked that question. And part of it is because there's so much, even without knowing our kids' genotypes, there's so much we can do with understanding about how their genes are influencing their behavior via temperament. That I think that's kind of the critical information to get out. And the other piece is, I think that we have to lay the foundation for how genes influence behavior in a much better way. And by that, what I mean is most of the biology that lots of us got in high school, so most of the genetics that the average person remembers is single gene, maybe some Punnett squares, maybe some wrinkly and, versus not peas, maybe brown eyes and blue eyes. That is not, of course, how the vast majority of things that are genetically influenced that have big impacts on our lives. So cardiovascular diseases, cancers, psychiatric and substance use outcomes, kids' behavior problems, they are all what we call complex genetics, where it is thousands of genes that all just have a little bit of an effect and that interact with the environment. And so the question becomes, how do we give genetic information to parents, to the average individual in a way that is understandable and that will enable them to know what they can do with it in ways that will promote positive behavior change and not a sense of helplessness or I'm destined to have this problem, so what am I going to do with it? And so actually, that's a whole other line of research that my group is working on is because the way that we will convey information about your propensity toward impulsivity or toward anxiety or toward addiction is going to be what's called a genetic risk score, a PRS, a polygenic risk score. And it will be a sum of how many of these risk enhancing variants you carry across your entire genome, weighted by how important that variant is. So it's a number that's not meaningful. They follow a bell-shaped distribution. And so some of us are, in that upper tail. So how do you let individuals know that in a way that can be empowering and that they can then use that to promote positive change? And then, of course, thinking about how we're going to do that with our kids is a whole other layer. And right now we're spending billions of dollars on gene identification, and we're spending very little money on the research as to how we're going to give that information back to people. So the short answer is, I think your question is critical and we're working on it, but it's actually unclear how we're going to do that well at this point.
I love that. This is a very thoughtful answer, and this is an amazing talk. So thank you so much, Danielle. I would like to end with David Shepard's comment in the chat, which you can see, but just for those watching this at home later. He says, really enjoyed this talk. Also really appreciated how you talked about how to become an author first and then gave details about your research second. It is rare in academia for someone to have the self-control to just not ramble about their research. I think we've all been to those talks. Keep up the great work. And so sorry that we lost you from VCU.
Well, thank you for those kind comments. And you haven't lost me. I'm still around. Part of my heart is still here at VCU. I would still, love to, hopefully when we can eventually grab coffee. And thank you so much for including me in this.
Thank you. Many thanks to Professor Danielle Dick and to all of you in the audience who are still with us. For those of you who couldn't make it, a recording of this event will be posted on our websites in the next couple of days. Please mark your calendars for our next event at the HRC in the series Meet VCU Authors. 3 weeks from today, on February the 28th, we'll be welcoming Professor Masa Lamu, an assistant professor in the Department of Sculpture and Extended Media at VCU, who will speak to us about the material and expressive aspects of articulage. And we hope to see many of you and your students at this and at future events. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us today and for supporting the HRC, and have a good night. Many thanks, Danielle, and congratulations